Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
I'm Sonia Strimban.
And today we're looking at Wild Strawberries.
Vad har du emot mig egentligen?
Ska jag svara dig uppriktigt?
Jag frågar dig.
Du är en gammal egoist, farbror Isak. Du är fullkomligt hänsynslös. Du har aldrig lyssnat till någon annan än dig själv. Men du maskerar det bra bakom din gammelmans finess och din vänliga charm. Men du är en benhård egoist. Sen må du tal och skrift utmålas som den stora människovännen. Men vi som har sett dig på nära håll, vi vet vem du är. Oss lurar du inte. Kommer du till exempel ihåg när jag kom till dig för en månad sedan? Jag hade någon idiotisk idé om att du skulle hjälpa Evald och mig, så jag bad att få bo hos dig några veckor. Kommer du ihåg vad du svarade?
Ja. Jag sa att du hjärtans gärna fick bo hos mig.
Så här sa du, fast det har du väl glömt. Försök inte dra in mig i dina och Evalds äktenskapliga kalamiteter, för de struntar jag i. Och var och en får klara sitt.
Sa jag det?
Du sa mer än så.
Det var värst.
Så här sa du ordagrant. Jag har ingen respekt för själsliga lidanden, så kom inte till mig och beklaga dig. Men om du behöver lite psykisk onani kan jag ordna en bra själskvackare. Eller kanske en präst. Det är ju så modernt numera.
Sa jag det?
Du är ganska kategorisk i dina omdömen, farbror Isak. Det vore hemskt att på ett eller annat sätt vara beroende av dig.
This is perhaps one of Bergman's best-known films, and certainly one of his most discussed films, whether it's film essays, criticisms, it's collected quite a word count.
Even parodies.
Right, and, there's a lot of good reasons. A great performance by the lead, a really complex and layered plotline, plenty of symbolism, and this film came in 1957, right after The Seventh Seal.
Yeah, I think the fact that it comes on the heels of The Seventh Seal is actually significant here, because we see Bergman exploring and touching on similar themes that he did in The Seventh Seal. Even kind of like structurally in a way there's a similarity. So you have a male lead character who is on the verge of dying or death, and he knows it. Right. So he begins to reflect on his life, realizing now that he's on the verge of death, he actually hasn't lived at all.
And what I find very interesting about the movie is that Bergman does this in a way that is very accessible to a general audience, but it's also very, very much a movie that on the surface is about a man aging. But throughout the film, there's just so many little details, a very complex cast of characters especially. And I wanted to touch on Victor Sjöström because he was one of the directors who helped Bergman get his career rolling. We've talked about him a couple times now, most particularly in the fact that Crisis wouldn't have been completed unless Victor Sjöström stepped in and kind of completed that movie. Bergman was kind of falling apart. It was his first actual film. And then Victor came back and he performed in To Joy as the conductor. Now, Bergman says that he didn't really choose him for this role initially. When he was writing the screenplay, he was sick, as we talked about before. When he wrote The Seventh Seal, he was also ill. So I think he was looking at a lot of those themes, and Victor sort of personified those themes. And this has become the Sjöström film, the film of his career. But Victor Sjöström is Bergman in this movie.
I think definitely, as we've seen from Bergman before, and as he does quite frequently, he works through a lot of his own kind of crises and neuroses,
but I mean,
in his films.
You kind of have to picture him laying in that hospital, weighing whether or not he's going to see the light of day outside the walls of the hospital again, and looking at his own mortality. That's what this movie is.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely confronting, your own, like your vulnerability as a human being, and also not just that, but also evaluating how you've lived. So now that you're potentially on the brink of death, you're assessing what kind of human being was I when I lived? What am I leaving behind? What is my legacy? And I think that's what the real thrust of this movie is about. And Sjöström's performance, you're right, I absolutely loved it. It was, I mean, for lack of a better word, it was pretty sublime. I mean, a lot of the movie is written on his face, whether it's intentional or not as a performance. He embodies the character
Right, and I think that they kind of took him, I don't know if it was out of retirement, but he was certainly, this is his last performance, which I think is one reason why it's become his ultimate performance. But he was taken out of retirement and sort of reassured that this wasn't a very strenuous role, but he apparently struggled on the set to remember his lines. He wanted to get home by a certain time of the day to have his whiskey. So this was a movie that he literally struggled to make. So he was his character in some sense.
Yeah, and the character is definitely struggling with himself. So that being said, maybe we should talk a little bit about what's happening in the movie.
Yes.
So it's interesting because to give a plot summary of this film, I think would do it a disservice. So I don't think we need to do that. But I think we can definitely pick up on some highlights of the film that are strong. So one thing that really, I think, worked in the film's favor, and we've seen Bergman try to do this before, is this layering of realities and time. So he really interrupts time because we have this man who's living in the present, but he also has an alternate reality in a dream state. And then he has a lot of kind of dream and real-time flashbacks to his childhood, so there's this whole nostalgic, melancholic kind of reflective element.
Right. I think the most obvious comparison is to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, because a lot of these flashbacks, he's in the scene and he is observing a situation that either he was present in or wasn't present at. And I just couldn't help but draw the parallels.
That's true. And the other parallel is that through each reflection or through each flashback, he has a guide in the film.
Sara, det är din kusin Isak. Ja, jag har blivit lite gammal förstås. Så jag är mig inte särskilt lik. Men du har inte ändrat dig det allra minsta.
Cousin, who he used to be in love with. In fact, she was his first love. Their relationship fell apart in their youth. She ended up marrying his brother. But that was the first real crisis of his life. And I think it was a crisis that, as a character, he never dealt with. And that pain really kind of amputated him from life and living and affected the rest of his relationships and really skewed his value system into how he perceived life and how he engaged with life, which is really what he's reflecting on. And, you know, the end of the film is a very accelerated timeline. So it all basically happens in 24 hours, not less than 24 hours.
Yeah, it's almost an afternoon.
But yet he reflects over his whole lifetime. So it's the elasticity of time in the movie, it adds a dimension of complexity to the story and what the character is working through. So the character of Sarah, who is his cousin, who he loved, there's an interesting parallel. So in one of his nostalgic reflections, he's reflecting on the scene where she's picking wild strawberries as a gift for her uncle whose birthday it is. And then time crosses. So he goes from his flashback in the past to reality today, where there's a girl who looks a lot like his cousin, also young and blonde, and also named Sarah. And, you know, he's really confused because of that intersection of time. And what Bergman is really doing, he's introducing another temporality to us where he's talking about generations of people and the relationships that they built.
I think it's quite fascinating how many generations are actually in this film. Aside from Isak, our main character, Isak's mother is the oldest generation here, and then we've got Isak himself and his wife who's died. They're sort of that second generation. The third one is his son and Isak's daughter-in-law, the husband and wife. Then, younger than them, you have the three young adults there. And then lastly, we have the daughter-in-law's unborn baby, who's sort of that fifth generation in the film. And it's just very interesting how Bergman has played with age. There's so many stages here. In some ways, they sort of represent every stage of Isak's life.
It's not just life from generation to generation. It's also kind of learning, right? And the connectivity of time. So from each generation, it's like Bergman is showing us where there are opportunities for people to better connect with each other. And I think one of the things that Isak had failed to do with his life, which he starts to regret as, you know, the movie goes on and he realizes, is he's failed to make those connections. He's failed to leave that human legacy and build the relationships either with his mother, so the previous generation before him, because their relationship is very bizarre, or with his son, which is a very disjointed relationship. And in fact, his daughter-in-law goes to great lengths to let him know the like basically how much his son despises him, to the point where he actually refuses to have children because he doesn't want there to be a next generation. He doesn't want the same kind of replica of bad relations and bad family ties that he had with his own father. It's not so much Bergman's view on life, because I don't think there's a conclusive answer here. It's more Bergman's struggle with life, right?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, he's really opening up in the film what I think he deals with internally every day. Do I live my life according to some kind of set of rules given to me by some kind of institutional body, whether it's, you know, the law or religion or, you know, some kind of set of rules? Or do I live simply by my own natural impulses as a human being? Do I enjoy the simplicity, the spontaneity,
the wild strawberries
of life? Yeah, and I think that's, like, we were actually talking about that earlier, and we said, oh, in The Seventh Seal there's this big critical scene where they're sharing a bowl of wild strawberries and it seems to be somehow symbolic, and then the next movie, which has such huge critical acclaim, is called Wild Strawberries. What's the connection? And for me, I think wild strawberries really are symbolic of that natural simplicity, the natural sweetness, the things that any human being should be able to discover just simply by being themselves.
I think we were talking about, not to go too far back into The Seventh Seal, but the fact that the juggler and his friends, who sort of had a more carefree lifestyle, were the ones enjoying the wild strawberries with their meal, while the knight was, you know, caught within that struggle of religion. Watching Wild Strawberries really answers some questions for The Seventh Seal as well.
There's definitely a strong connection between the two thematically, except in Wild Strawberries, it's a lot more accessible to the viewer that wants to connect with those themes, because you're not, you know, trying to, you know, take yourself back to the Middle Ages and the bubonic plague and all that kind of stuff.
Well, there's a lot to talk about for Wild Strawberries, and so we've decided to break this into two parts. So this week we've taken a look at some of the characters, some of the themes, Wild Strawberries in particular, but we want to touch on other symbolism in the movie and answer that pesky question of what is it with Bergman and mirrors? So we'll join us next week where we talk about Wild Strawberries again in part 2 on Breaking Down Bergman.